So components play an important role. Let's have a closer look. I already changed this component in the first module of this course. I changed this title property if you remember that. Well, let's have a closer look at what's actually happening here and how a component is defined in Angular 2. I already explained that we have this TypeScript class, app component in this case, and that we have this add component decorator here, well, attached to this class kind of. Notice that this add component decorator gets imported from add Angular core, so it is provided by the Angular 2 framework. Decorators are used a lot in Angular 2, and decorators allow us to transform normal TypeScript classes into something else, into something more powerful, into a component in this case. If we wouldn't have this decorator, then this component would be worth nothing, or this class would be worth nothing. The app wouldn't work. So we need this decorator. Now what is it actually doing? Well, we get this template URL thing, which I already explained in the first module. Each component in Angular 2, as it is a part of our final web page, needs some HTML code to display. I guess that makes sense because otherwise you wouldn't see anything, right? And the HTML code belonging to a component is stored in a template. This template can be an external file, like it is here in the app component HTML file, or it could also be defined directly in this TS file here. And I'll come back to this in the next video. The same is true for the styling. Now you don't have to have styling, so you could delete this property here or this argument of the decorator. You could delete this and it would still work. We don't need to have styling. But if we have a styling for our component, then we can also have that in an external file, or actually multiple files, since this is an array and we can link multiple paths here. Or we could also define it in this file, and I will come back to this too. Now the important takeaway is, styling is optional, templates are not. Each component needs a template, and only one template, not multiple ones, not 0, 1. So this is the template, the HTML code which gets displayed. Now the cool thing about this HTML code is it is controlled by our TypeScript code, so by this code in the class, which is why we have a property here and can output this property in our HTML code with string interpolation, one form of data binding Angular 2 offers. And I will come back to data binding and what it actually is and how it works in later videos in this module here. Now there is also one other thing in this add component decorator, the selector. Now this is a very important part. The selector is what allows us to use this component throughout our application. Think about it this way. We're kind of creating our own HTML elements. That is what components are in the end, our custom HTML elements. So like we have a heading element here, which is a built-in one. With a component, we can create a new one, and here in the selector, we decide how we want to insert it into our HTML code. This selector works like a CSS selector. So AppRoot here would refer to an element AppRoot, which of course doesn't exist in HTML by default, but now it does because we're telling out Angular 2 what to do if it encounters such an element. Now we don't have to use this syntax. We could also add a hashtag in front, and now this component would be used wherever we have an element with an ID of AppRoot. So for example, div ID equals AppRoot. Now this div would render this component. So we don't have to use this element syntax without leading hash or dot just like this, but we commonly do so. It's kind of a convention to put your components or to select your components in this way by creating new elements. But just to keep that in mind, the selector can also select IDs, CSS classes, generally how CSS selectors work. So okay, we have this selector, we have this AppRoot component here, but how do we actually use it? Well, we have our index.html file here, And actually, since we're building a single page application with the Angular 2 framework, there is only one page which gets loaded. And this one page is not our component. It's the index.html file, because it's the root HTML file in our source folder. Now this is a key takeaway. The index.html file is the file getting loaded by our server. And if we ever deploy our Angular 2 application to another server, it will always be that index.html file which gets loaded. It is a single page application in the end. Now if we have a look at this file, it's very lean. It's a normal HTML5 skeleton. We don't even see any script imports in here. But one thing we do see is this element. Do you recognize that? It's our component. It's no built-in HTML tag. It's our component, app_root. So this is how we use our components, and this is how we can also use our component selectors in templates of our components. And you will see this in one of the next videos. Now, the last missing piece is, how does Angular 2 get started in the first place? We don't have a script anywhere in this index.html file, which seems to be the only file which gets loaded. How does it get started, and how does it then know that it should kind of replace this app_root element here? How does it know that this app_root element exists? We'll have a look at this in the next video.